We are now a nation of haters.
Fending off threats of violence.
Hate calls, even death threats.
Targeted with death threats.
I get death threats, not every day, but close to every day. Some of them are very specific.
Did ugly personal attacks.
What got to me was the vitriol and the vulgarity that was just unleashed at me in ways that I couldn't even understand where that was coming from.
It has all gone too far.
I don't think there's anything more important for us to address. To go from being a nation of haters.
Do you have some thoughts on those chants, which also, included vote him out?
Yeah, I think the chants were appalling, but certainly to be expected when you're in the heart of the swamp.
To a nation that has the presumption of grace. The presumption of grace means you don't assume that the person who you're in combat with on social media or cable TV is a bad person. We need to find a way to go from being a society that has a presumption of hatred to a presumption of grace. The right thing to do is to try to show everyone, except in the most extreme circumstances, the presumption of grace. But the most important thing is to find a way to give the incentive to do not what is strong and wrong, but strong and right. And strong and right begins, and I think ends to some extent, with the presumption of grace.
Ladies and gentlemen, please give a warm welcome to Mark Halperin.
When I was 11 years old, there was a bike I really wanted. And so every night I prayed for the bike. And then after a while, I realized that's not how God works. So I stole the bike and I prayed for forgiveness. That's a joke I got off the internet today because I was looking to say something funny to start about the concept of the presumption of grace and all the things that relate to it. And forgiveness is a big part of that. Good evening. Welcome. Thank you for joining this town hall. Our focus for the start is going to be on the presumption of grace, something that I've been thinking about and talking about, writing about, and asking about now for a while. I want to know, for each of you, answer two questions. One is, can you afford James Comey, the presumption of grace? Could you, after what he did in 2016, when his decisions effectively cost Hillary Clinton the election and made Donald Trump president? Can you afford James Comey, the same man, the presumption of grace, after he effectively spied on Donald Trump and his campaign and then moved the country down the path towards impeachment? James Comey is a complicated man. He has been a hero to some and a villain to others, and he has been afforded the presumption of grace at times, and at other times the presumption of hate by people in both parties. The pivot point really was May of 2017 when Donald Trump fired Comey as head of the FBI. And the whole confusion that caused, I think, can be seen in this clip from the day Comey was fired by Trump with Stephen Colbert.
Huge story that broke just minutes ago, like less than 10 minutes ago. FBI Director James Comey has just been fired by Donald Trump. Wow. Huge Donald Trump fans here tonight.
So whether you think Comey today is someone deserving of the presumption of hate or the presumption of grace is maybe different than what you thought before, but I would argue no matter what you think of what he's done over the last 5 years, he is still worthy very much of the presumption of grace, as everyone is. So tonight I'm going to talk about four things. First is what's happened since I last convened everybody in a town hall and we talked about this topic, some of the feedback I've gotten, some of the reactions, some of the questions that have been raised. Then I want to lay out my theory of what I call the four-headed monster, an area that I think is one of the great locations of a presumption of hatred, and where I think our joint efforts could be an early sign of the prospect of success in changing our culture from one of hate to one of grace. And then I want to recruit you in that effort and explain how we're going to proceed. And then again, get some of your ideas on the presumption of grace, some of your questions about it. So first, what the reaction's been like. It's been extraordinarily lovely. Most of the people who've reached out to me have encouraged me, have suggested they recognize that in some ways this is a challenge, but it's a necessary challenge because the nature of our political discourse, our social discourse, in many cases, our family discourse needs to shift from hate to grace. And I've heard people with ideas. I've heard people who have asked me probing questions about how this will work, and some of that we'll talk about tonight. But in general, I've been very encouraged. Now, there have been some moments that have been a little bit less encouraging. Probably the biggest category is a lot of people say, I'm all for this, but I need a pass. I need a pass for my uncle who's a bigot, or I need a pass for someone who's in elective office. They want to know, alternatively, if they don't get a pass, how can they show grace to someone? How can they show grace, for instance, to someone who voted for the presidential candidate they did not vote for? And there's no doubt that at least right now in the aftermath of the election, that is for many people I hear from the toughest case. One of my readers sent me an email and said this: I can't look at people that support Trump with a presumption of grace. It has been a 4-year assault on decency, honesty, empathy, and the shared values that we have always struggled to live up to in our country. And so I know for many people, the president is someone they don't feel they can give a presumption of grace to. My main reaction to emails like that, besides compassion for understanding how they feel about it, is to say, I don't think this is going to work if people want to pass on 75 or 80 million people. That's too big a group to say, well, they're not going to get the presumption of grace. As I said previously, it's the hard cases, except for the very, very, very most difficult cases. It's the hard cases where we need to rise to the occasion. One of the people who wrote to me, another person, was concerned when I talked about the early sense I had of the plan I'm going to talk about tonight, the proposal. And she said this: if we begin to reach out to the haters in social media, it'll take a lot of stamina and perseverance to break through their shield that protects them from reality. So we're going to talk about social media tonight because I think it's pretty obvious to all of us that that's a big source, not the only source of a presumption of hate where we need to have more grace, but it's a big one. I want to talk about, based on the questions and the feedback I've gotten, what this isn't about, because I think defining what it isn't will help us define what it is. Being interested in the presumption of grace in our discourse and in our society is not about being perfect. It's easy to slip into hate. It's part of the human condition. I slipped into it twice on Saturday, and I think about 5 times on Sunday. And I know how easy it is to waver, but this is not just a movement. This is not just a cause for people who are perfect. It doesn't require you to never feel hate. It just requires you to try to limit it and to try to think about how we can work to limit it in others. This is also not a debate about defining the term. And I had a lot of messages about that. You can say it's do unto others. You can say you should treat everybody like a human being, not question people's motives or character. There's lots of ways to describe it, but I think it's one of those things where you know it when you see it. And I think most of us know when we see something that's operating not on the presumption of grace, what that is and what those instances are. But I'm not that interested in defining it because I think everybody should kind of come to their own definition. I think those will be roughly the same. This is also not a religious thing, a religious movement, a religious concept. Certainly, most major religions speak a lot about grace. They might use different words for it, and I certainly welcome input from people and participation from people who see this in a religious context. That's great, but this must be all inclusive. It must include people who see this in other terms. And so those who are concerned that I see this in religious terms or that using grace is a freighted word, that's just not how I see it. I think, as I said, everybody can understand the concept regardless of what religion or what faith they have, or if they have no faith at all in terms of organized religion. And then finally, to define what it's not, this is not about me. As I've said, my experience in my life, in my last 3 years in particular, where I've learned a lot about the importance and necessity of both giving grace and receiving it, giving forgiveness and receiving it. I certainly bring, as anyone would, my own experiences to this, but I see this as partly about the kind of culture that I live in, but it's also about our broader culture and the need for everybody to be able to be comfortable in going forward, knowing that the presumption of grace will be extended to them and to work hard to extend it to others. So while people might want to focus on my experience, that's not what this is about for me. And it's not the context in which I think about it or that I talk about it. So moving on now to what I see as kind of the best analysis I've been able to do so far about what propels this presumption of hate and how we can change the incentives for the individual actors in this whole cosmic universe that drives hate so easily and where grace is forced out. My focus is on Twitter. Now, all of social media has hatred, cable TV, websites, family gatherings. Twitter is not the only place, but I'm singling out Twitter because I think it's so influential in the discourse of politicians, of activists, and of journalists. And I think it's the place where so much of the what I call the four-headed monster, which I'll talk about, so much of the energy of the four-headed monster comes from Twitter. So don't get me wrong, my aspirations for our movement go far beyond trying to clean up Twitter. But that's where I want to start, because I think I've come up with a way to test whether we have the capacity to try to change things. Twitter is not real life, but it controls real life, as they say. And in a way, no one would disagree with that. The users of Twitter all would say, oh, I hate the thing. It's a sewer. It's filled with so much hatred. As far as I know, though, no one has tried the kind of effort I'm proposing this evening to try to clean it up. And so I'm excited by the fact that there's a problem that lots of people see, that no one has tried to solve, that I believe has a potential solution that is relatively simple if we can execute it. There are lots of people who look at Twitter as a sewer, who I think are a bit hypocritical about it, or at least narrow in their perspective. Thinking of one television network anchor who constantly complains to people around him about how he's attacked on Twitter, that he's never afforded the presumption of grace. And that person will complain about individual tweets, will point them out. And then if you look at his own Twitter feed, you'll see plenty of negativity on his Twitter feed. He does not accord others the presumption of grace. And that's pretty typical. There are plenty of people I know who get attacked on Twitter who also attack people on Twitter. So the four-headed monster starts with Twitter. The four-headed monster, it consists of four elements. They all work in concert. I'm going to talk about it as a linear assembly line, starting with Twitter, going through evildoers, the media, and leaders. But often in individual case studies, you'll see that it's not just linear. It might start with an evildoer, or it might start with the media, or it might start with Twitter and then go to the evildoer and then back to Twitter. But these are the four heads of the monster. And I think if we talk about their individual roles, you can see that it doesn't really matter how linear it is. They all interact in a way that really does serve to perpetuate, more than most areas of life, I think, the presumption of hate. So let me talk one by one about the four heads of the monster and how they work. The thing that they share in common, all four elements, all four heads, is they don't have any concern for facts. They don't have any concern for due process, for prior relationships. They don't care much about past success. They don't care much about past good works. They don't care much about humanity. And most of all, they don't care about grace. On those four elements, they just don't care about grace. It's not a priority. There's no incentive for them to care about grace. All the incentives are towards hate. So Twitter, what happens on Twitter? Well, if you're treated badly on Twitter, chances are no one's going to come to your defense, because if they do, they'll be the subject of attack. They'll be a target. So what happens when someone makes a mistake, but they become a target of a mob on Twitter, then 90 to 100% of the things that are tweeted in response to them in these cases is going to be negative. And the other three heads of the monster will see that. And each of the other three heads of the monster mobilizes. So the Twitter mob, you all know what I'm talking about. Someone does something in the public life. Maybe they do something on Twitter, and the mob decides that they need to be attacked. Maybe they need to be canceled in the view of the mob, but at a minimum, they need to be attacked. They need to be treated with hatred and afforded no grace whatsoever. So when that happens, not always, but often there's also the threat of the evildoer. The evildoer is a head that often exists. Sometimes it exists undetected, but the evildoer is someone who sees an opportunity. Sometimes they instigate the Twitter mob, but typically they'll see the Twitter mob going after someone who they'd like to see destroyed or taken down in some way. And the evildoer will do what they can to spread it along. They might, if they have a lot of Twitter followers, retweet. They might encourage other people to tweet. They might call the tweets the attention of the press or to other people in the lives, to people in the lives of the person who's the target. But the evildoer can operate with a lot of impunity because they're never suspected. They're seen as simply one of the four heads, and they're accepted as part of the process. Someone who is helping to spread hate. There are lots of cases I can cite for you where the evildoers are apparent to anyone paying attention. But as I suggested, there's some where the evildoer is not visible and perhaps is known to the person who's the target, But that person is highly motivated to not only create more hatred on Twitter against the target, but to make sure that that hatred is seen. The next group is the press. And I refer to the concept of the pro hate media, but that's really a shorthand for all the media. Because right now there's no one in the media, there's no organization that deviates from the business model of the more hate the better. There's not a lot of clicks or eyeballs or buzz that comes with extending a presumption of grace. And so whether it's an organization that's controlled in effect by a woke mob or a fierce right-wing mob, you can take any organization you can name practically in the whole country, television, internet, cable TV, broadcast TV. You see, I've got some examples up in that slide that was up. I mentioned last time the Daily Caller, the Daily Beast, but it's true of the New York Times as well. The people there only see negative stories. And if you read stories about Twitter mobs, the tweets that will get cited are the negative ones. You won't ever read about people coming to someone's defense, almost ever. And as I said, they've got a profit motive to be part of the four-headed monster, but they also have a personal motive. Sometimes it's ideological because they like the motives of the mob, of why the mob wants to go after someone. But sometimes it's simply that they don't want to be targeted themselves. They don't want to be seen as out of step. There are plenty of senior people at organizations with responsibility who you would think would occasionally say, well, that's not being imbued with a presumption of grace, but they're afraid that they'll be next, that they'll be targeted next. And so their decisions are often predicated not just on financial considerations, but also on personal ones and institutional ones. The final leg, or head rather, of the four-headed monster is leaders. And as always, I use leaders in air quotes. These are university presidents, newspaper editors and publishers, the head CEOs of companies. These are people who know that our society is poorer when the presumption of hate dominates over the presumption of grace. But they too are worried that the mob will come for them. They too look at the dynamics of the four-headed beast, of which they are one head, and they don't want to get in the way of the movement, of the direction of the movement. So they're told, these leaders, by the head of their legal department, the head of their PR department, the head of their HR department, of where applicable, their investor relations department. They're told, don't fight the mob. The mob will win. So you need to do what you need to do right now to give in to the mob. If that means firing someone, fire them. If that means canceling something that's been announced, cancel it. If that means issuing a public apology, do it, even if you don't believe in it. And the greatest problem for these folks, and the ultimate goal, I believe, is to try to change the incentives of the leaders. Is that possible? Those are the four heads on the beast. And so the question is, what can we do about them? I don't believe in the short term that we can change the motives and the behavior and the incentives of the evildoers. They're motivated in a case-by-case basis, but they have a very particular goal in mind. I don't believe in the short term that we can change the behavior of the media, which is not so different than it's always been. The press has always preferred negative over positive. But the current dynamics, I believe, are too powerful to change. The two parts that I want to work on are the leaders, and then most directly, Twitter. If you look at Twitter, as I say, and those of you who are on it know, it's very difficult to stop a mob. Once someone is targeted with negativity, very difficult to stop and to get people to be defended. Why is it difficult? Well, if you defend someone, you'll be attacked, typically. People who've defended me on Twitter in the last 3 years typically have been forced to delete their tweets or hope that the mob moves on to another target. What we need to do is we need to build a good mob of grace on Twitter. I'm hoping a lot of you are already on Twitter. If not, we're going to start doing tutorials for some of you to get you on and teach you how to work it. One of the challenges is people don't necessarily want to defend someone they don't know. someone where they may not know the facts. Why is this mob going after this person? Maybe there's some reason. Now, there's never a reason for them to be attacked without a presumption of grace, but our good mob of grace is going to be well armed with the facts they need to be able to participate, and they're also going to be mobilized quickly. And we're not going to attack people. We're going to stand up to bullies the way bullies need to be stood up to in this instance, which is not with cruelty, not with a lack of fairness, not with shaming, but with love, grace, and understanding. What we need to do is consciousness raise. Every case is going to be different, but the way we will win, the way that we will have a case study or two, I hope, in which we're successful, is when there's activity on Twitter, someone is in trouble, someone is being targeted, and we step in to ask the people who are going after them to think about what they're doing. And we're going to have to workshop the right language. I don't want this to be a thing where people just cut and paste the same language, but I want everybody to be on the same page about the kind of language that's going to be required here. And my hope is that if we can execute this, that there will be instances that we can then take to the press, that we can take to other like-minded people and say, look what happened here. This person was bullied, harassed, criticized, threatened in a way that did not reflect the presumption of grace. We're not trying to stifle debate. We're not trying to stifle speech. We're trying to counter speech that's negative and filled with hate with a little bit of a pushback. Again, not trying to embarrass anyone, not trying to take anyone down, but trying to elevate the discussion. Now, one thing I like about this plan is it doesn't cost any money. Our plan is to mobilize everybody who's able to participate and willing to participate with an email or a text. And all it's going to require is for people to go on Twitter and write some stuff. Again, the idea is to change the incentives of the Twitter mob. I believe that if people were confronted with what they wrote in Twitter in a way that was elevated and light was shined on it, they'd think twice before they did it. I've, in the past, sent tweets that I regretted sending that were too mean-spirited. Had someone shown them to me and not fought with me. Because what happens when people do confront each other on Twitter, where it's presumption of hate versus presumption of hate, people get their back up. They rarely want to give in unless the facts are truly against them in a way that makes them give in. But mostly it just escalates. We want to de-escalate it. Why would people change? I think the big thing that I've learned in the last 3 years is what leaves people vulnerable to the Twitter mob is that they aren't validated or contextualized. What do I mean by that? That they're seen as standing alone. Even famous people, even people who seem powerful, once the mob comes for them, they're alone. And when they're alone, when they're not contextualized within their achievements, their society, their families, it's easier for people to treat them without a presumption of grace because they don't see them as human beings. They see them as two-dimensional figures. And so what my goal is, as much as anything else with these tweets that I'm hoping people will send, is to contextualize people, not to overstate them as perfect people or as people who are beyond reproach by any means, but to simply try to make them three-dimensional. Because I think it's much harder to threaten, bully, attack someone if they're not, if they're seen as part of society, as part of a group, as part of a family, as someone with a history, as someone with feelings, and someone who is worthy, as we all are, with few exceptions, of a presumption of grace. So that's my plan. The practical way that we're going to try to do this is I'd love for as many of you as are willing, and as I said, if you're not on Twitter, but you're willing to get on Twitter, I'd love for as many of you as willing to give us permission to contact you by text or by email when there's a case that we see. And there's 100 an hour. We haven't yet settled on exactly which cases we're going to pick. But when we see a case where we think that it would be good to set an example, to try to raise some consciousness, we'll send you a text, we'll send you an email, we'll explain the facts, we'll explain who's being targeted, we'll explain what they're being targeted for, and we'll ask you to get on Twitter, and we'll tell you the people who we think are worthy of hearing from you, and we'll ask you to weigh in with them, and we'll monitor it all very closely. And as I said, my goal with this project, this initial project, is to demonstrate to ourselves and hopefully to a wider group that this can work, that we can intervene in a way that changes behavior. Hopefully it changes the behavior of the people whose consciousness we raise, but hopefully also we're able to publicize that and hopefully set an example for a wider universe of people to say, this is what Twitter has to be. This isn't what our communication has to be. And if that happens, because I believe that most of the so-called leaders would like to not let the mob run their lives, I believe that they'll be freed up. It will be glasnost for them. It'll be a period of opening and reawakening that they will see the possibility that they can say, well, there's this mob that's going after this person, but there's also a good mob of grace, and they see it differently. And they've given me a reason to give some grace to the person who's being attacked. If we can develop some case studies over the next couple weeks, if we can find a way to work together and hopefully grow, my estimate is it's going to take 10,000 of us, and there are not 10,000 people on this Zoom, unfortunately. But my estimate is it'll take 10,000 of us. Not everybody will be able to weigh in every time. Not everybody will be willing to weigh in every time for whatever reason. But if we can get critical mass on enough times to produce evidence that this can make a difference, I'm confident from not just the last few weeks, but the last few years of my life and really my whole professional life, that there are many people like you all in the country. Many people understood the facts, understood the stakes, and thought that speaking up would make change more towards a presumption of grace as the defining characteristic of our society, as that the change that we can make, that in some ways is the hardest change of all because we're asking people to change hearts, but in some ways is the easiest change. It costs no money. And if we make this one change, I believe a cascade will occur of positive change elsewhere. Then we can really accomplish something with this. So, as I said, we're gonna email you all and ask you to sign up if you're willing to participate. If you need to learn how to use Twitter, we're happy to teach you. And then you'll need to look for emails and texts from us that asks you a call to action to say, let's all figure out how to influence what's going on with this particular person at this particular time. We'll capture all that, learn from it, and hopefully be able to set an example that we can extend to other things. We can extend to other social media. We can extend to cable TV. We've all had the experience in the last few months of seeing someone out in public without a mask who really should be wearing a mask and face that choice about whether to say something to them. Most of us don't. It's a difficult thing to do. What I'm proposing is a difficult thing to do. It's basically asking you to go to a stranger in public and say, you really shouldn't be doing that. And here's why. But that's what we need to do. Because if we don't, I don't see a chance that the presumption of hate will not continue across beyond Twitter to so many realms of life. If we can set an example and get some tangible results, I think we can make a big difference, and I'm excited about it. Thank you all for joining, for listening, and I'm going to open up now for questions of this. I'd love your ideas, your suggestions, your critique of my idea about the presumption of grace. And Paul, let's open it up for questions, please.
Thank you, Mark. We've got Sue in North Carolina with the first question. Sue, go ahead.
Well, I'm interested in doing this. I see, people attacking comments that I might make on things or send me private messages. I guess I'm a little concerned about getting a private message from somebody. I've gotten some really awful messages. I mean, how do we not get attacked that way ourselves? I mean, I'm on Twitter, but I usually am, responding to an article or something like that.
Right. Well, here's what I'm counting on, and believe me, I'm super concerned about that. I don't take that lightly at all. Here's what I'm counting on. Number one, I'm counting on strength in numbers. Even 10 people, all rowing in the same direction, all rowing towards grace, I think will make a difference, because there is strength in numbers, and there is it'll be such a disruption to the norm. Second, I'm counting on bullies reacting the way bullies historically do. Which is to say they'll back down. And the mob's pretty fickle. I think that we can turn, if we turn the loudest voices, I think we can turn others. And then finally, I'm counting on the power of language. I've gotten some very negative emails. I emphasize the positive ones, and the majority have been. but I've gotten some very negative emails from people. And I've been workshopping language in my replies to them by engaging in the presumption of grace towards them. And it's very difficult to come after someone who's espousing grace, I have found so far. Now, I'm not saying there aren't people on Twitter who will do it because that's their specialty, but I believe those three factors will largely insulate people, and we will monitor it closely. And if I'm wrong about those three factors being enough, we'll come to your defense, and we'll try to choose cases initially. We will choose cases initially that are not in the hottest of spotlights. We're not going to get between Elizabeth Warren and Sean Hannity in the beginning. We might eventually, but the idea would
either
be
one of those on.
well, we'll be directing you. We'll send you an email and say, let's say we're ready for Sean Hannity versus Elizabeth Warren. We'd send you an email or a text that said, Sean Hannity's going after Elizabeth Warren or vice versa, and here's their handle, and here's the kind of thing we'd like you to say. But in the beginning, we'll go after cases of people with fewer followers, which again I hope will insulate people. But there is some risk associated with this, even if I'm 100% right about the factors I cited. And we'll just hope for strength in numbers. And again, it's going to take some bravery. It's going to take some perseverance, as the person who sent me an email this week or last week suggested. But it's going to be easier if we do it together rather than separately. And if we contextualize and support each other.
My mother always said, Susie, just be gracious. So I guess I will put her words to work.
That's good. She probably wasn't thinking of Twitter at the first time she said it to you, but
no.
Thank you. I really appreciate. Thank you for the question and for joining us tonight and for joining in our gang of grace. Paul.
We have Robert in Illinois. Robert, you ready with your question?
Robert Jacoby from Illinois.
Good to see
you,
Robert.
My question
Thank
is
you.
really around sort of the area of anonymity, and if we're forced to sort of put ourselves out onto Twitter like, I am Robert, I am Mark, does that create a level of accountability where, not necessarily by shaming, but just making sure that I am a person out there, and takes back a little bit of my knee-jerk reaction and sort of violent language just by forcing that person to acknowledge that they are who they are?
Yeah, there's no doubt that a lot of the presumption of hate that exists on Twitter and elsewhere in social media is people not using their names. But we all can find examples. The network anchor I referred to earlier, he uses his name on all his tweets. He's pretty famous. It's not necessarily the case that people only do this anonymously. But I believe whether we're trying to raise the consciousness of someone who's got their real name and picture on there or someone who's not, either way, I believe it's the same effect. I believe that even anonymously, calling them out. And again, I try to use phrases that don't sound hostile or confrontational. Call them out is probably not the kind of phrase I would like us to be thinking of. Consciousness raising, contextualizing. Those are more along the lines of what I think will work. It has to be about love and compassion and about grace. So I think you're right that if we use our names, whether we're going to visit with someone online who is using their name or not, I think the important thing is we be three-dimensional figures as much as possible, just as the targets we're trying to help need to be three-dimensional figures. And we can make them three-dimensional figures much more easily if we're three-dimensional figures. I think a lot about this, even though it's impossible, but I would love to find some, very vulnerable person who really has there's no justification for them being bullied or harassed on Twitter. I'd love all of us to get on airplanes post COVID and have a press conference with them, stand side by side with them physically, because that's really the way you can contextualize someone a lot more easily. That's not possible, although maybe eventually it will be in high profile cases if we have our 10,000 strong all around the country. But for now, standing with them as much as possible as 3D people, making them 3D people, flesh and blood and vulnerability. That I think is and confidence in the righteousness of our efforts and our cause. That's, I think, the greatest strength that we have. Thank you for the question. Paul.
Thanks, Mark.
Thank you, Mark. We have Barbara from New York with a question. Barbara, go ahead.
Mark, I'm looking at it from a perspective of why we would need this. One of the reasons, and the face of our America is drastically changing the way when you look at the face of America, and I'm wondering whether this ungraceful rhetoric is a reflection of the fear that people are experiencing because all of a sudden they don't know how to act. They're being exposed to things that are really different from them, and they're seeing things which are different, and they don't know how to act. And so, when someone's fearful or unsure, many times they revert to, our reptilian background, and we start lashing out. And I'm wondering what your sense would be if that could be part of a cause for so much but mostly I think it's the fact that people would not act like this if they were in front of each other.
Well, on your second point, again, I think anonymity plays a role for some, but people act like this at family dinner tables, and they act like this in TV studios. They act like this on public transportation. So it doesn't require being anonymous, although, again, I think that's a factor for some. And I think what you cited is definitely a factor for some people in this country. There's obviously, long-term economic dislocation, concerns about the changing face of America. There's all sorts of things that make people uncomfortable and filled with anxiety and a desire to lash out at people they see as different or the other or a threat. But I don't think that explains everybody. There are plenty of people on Twitter and on other social media platforms who don't fit that model for one reason or another, and they're just as lacking in grace as the kind of people you described. So I definitely am interested in the model, in the kind of person you described. I definitely think that's a factor. I think the more we understand about why people do this, the better. But I got no expertise in that area. I can read the New York Times and science journals and try to understand it and talk to people who are experts. But I believe what I can add here is to try to analyze the four-headed monster and try to figure out how to change the incentives of the four-headed monster. And clearly, the more our language can appeal to their better angels, to the extent they have them, as we interact with them on Twitter, the greater success we'll have. And the more we understand the kind of reptilian concept you discussed, the better. But I don't think we're going to have as much expertise as we need to fully animate what we do. I think the language we come up with as best as we can should really be something that would work for anyone who's a human being who has a heart. Mm-hmm. And your category is one of them, but I think there are other categories as well.
Okay. Thank you.
But thank you for that question, and thank you for joining us tonight. Paul.
Thank you, Mark. We've got Joseph in California with a question. Joseph, please go ahead.
What you're saying really resonates with me. I think it resonates with a lot of people. What would help me is to know if there are some people or organizations or schools or whoever out there who are already modeling what you're talking about. Who are the good guys out there?
Well, a lot of the readers of my newsletter and a lot of people at this meeting. Look, it's hard to find an organization in any category, because what I see, from universities to media organizations to corporations to nonprofits, I see them all operating out of fear of the mob, out of manipulation by the evildoers, out of a reaction to the press. So there are organizations out there that pay lip service to this concept, and some who do more than that. But I can't send you any place where I can say that they're doing something in the real world that I think is changing the trajectory we're on. You ask any member of Congress, for instance, or any governor, what would you like society to be like? Would you like society to be more a society of presumption of hate or presumption of grace? I think all of them, maybe 98% of them would say, oh, we want a presumption of grace. But you don't see much leadership there. I'm embarrassed to say that a very prominent member of Congress the other day tweeted something very nasty about another member of Congress. It was nasty. It was also clever. And I'm embarrassed to say that I reached out to them to tell them how clever I thought it was. That was not good. I wasn't proud of that moment. I had alternative reasons for wanting to reach out to that person. I used the tweet as an excuse. But my point is, I can't tell you a place or a person to go I believe is looking at this the way I think it needs to be looked at. I know they exist. There are plenty of nonprofit organizations and charitable organizations that do a lot of good in this country. Make no mistake. But if you're asking me if they're essential to their mission and the positions of their leaders is to not let the mob win, I can't tell you a place I'm confident does that, because I've watched this closely now for several years, and I see places who you would think would take a stand and be principled, leaders who would do that. Their incentives are to do what the mob says is to be part of the four-headed monster. So I'm trying to build places that are like this. I'm trying to build one myself, but I'm trying to figure out the places to be allied with, because I need that 10,000 members of the gang. But I can't send you any place tonight. I wish I could. Thank you for the question, and thank you for your encouragement. Paul.
Mark, we've got Kevin from Massachusetts ready with a question. Kevin, you all set?
Hi, Mark. I'm Kevin O'Regan. And
nice to see you, sir.
When you first mentioned the presumption of grace, I was actually really attracted to it. And the idea of forming a gang of grace to provide love and compassion and understanding is, in my view, inspirational and really, really deeply important.
If there's a but coming, I'm going to cut you off. Go ahead.
Well, I'll say it's an and.
Okay.
I think that although it's a large idea, it comes down to small decisions by individuals to say, yes, I will become a member of the Gang of Grace. I will provide a presumption of grace to others. And in my own heart, the real challenge is when I think of people who have been persistently malevolent and unapologetic. How do you offer the presumption of grace to someone who has harmed so many people and is really unwilling, uninterested, and even will dismiss the idea of offering grace?
I think the best example from modern world history is Nelson Mandela, who showed grace to his jailers and to the governments that imprisoned him. We all feel the slings and arrows of the slights that come when people afford us no grace and afford us just hate, whether it's in our jobs or our families or online. Mandela rose above that, because trying to in a practical way or a psychological way or an emotional way to overcome what they've done to you, the aggrieved feelings you have through a lack of grace, it just doesn't work. It never reaches a satisfactory conclusion. And I think so much every day about the people I know whose lives have been really hurt, practically emotionally and in principle, by Donald Trump, and how much they struggle to show grace towards 75 million Americans. And whether it's the abstraction of 75 million Americans or the guy who lives across the street from you who voted for Trump, who you can't stand, we're never going to succeed. It's so hard to do. And as I said, I wasn't kidding when I said I failed this weekend. I've got plenty of people from my past and present for whom I struggle to do that. But I think it's some combination of trying to feel it in your heart and show it in your actions. You can disagree with them. You can make arguments to them. You can steer away from them and try to limit your interaction. But what you can't do successfully is match the things they've done that caused you to struggle to give them a presumption of grace with the same kinds of feelings and same kind of actions that they engaged in. And again, I go back to Mandela. John McCain is another example of someone who went back to Vietnam, being imprisoned, physically imprisoned for the length of time those gentlemen were imprisoned. I won't say that's worse than anything else, but it's pretty bad. And yet they found in their big hearts that the right way to deal with it was to rise above it. None of us will do it perfectly, but all of us have to do more of it. And we've got to be leaders. Just like I wish more of us had the courage to tell people to put on masks when they're not wearing them. I think we've got to have the courage to do this. And the reason, one of the many reasons I want to start on Twitter as a group, as a gang in coalition, is because then we won't be doing it alone. We will be doing it with others. And I hope that people are willing to do it as much for someone they don't agree with. If I ask those of you who are Trump opponents to join me on Twitter with a presumption of grace for Stephen Miller or for Mike Pence, that's going to be harder for you than if I ask you to do it for Elizabeth Warren. But it's just as important. It's just as important. As I said many times, it's easy to show the presumption of grace to people who haven't wronged us. It's easy in most cases. It's a lot harder for people who we feel wronged by or we feel haven't shown redeeming qualities. But I think with few exceptions of people living today, few exceptions, I think it's possible to do. Just read about Mandela, imagine Mandela's situation and the capacity he showed, extraordinary grace towards the actual jailers and the system that imprisoned him. And I think not all of us are Mandela, to say the least, but that's an example that we can learn from that's pretty powerful. Thank you for your question. Really appreciate it. Paul.
Thank you, Mark. Next up is Buckley in Wisconsin. Buckley, go ahead.
Hey, Mark, thanks for doing this. I've been thinking about this and what the parallel might be. And one of the things I've been thinking about is how this might relate to the struggle that we're going through with race relations right now, to where the mentality has changed that it's no longer good enough to just not be a racist, but you must take steps to being an anti-racist, no matter how small they are. So I'm thinking that the same applies here. It's no longer just good enough to not be part of the mob, but you also have to be proactive in showing some form of grace, no matter how small that form is. I'm just interested in your thoughts.
I think it's super important, and I think that there's so many people who see things, someone not wearing a mask, someone in their Twitter feed being attacked unfairly or without grace, and we just don't do anything. And part of why we've gotten to the point we've gotten is the four-headed monster has every incentive in the world to do what they do. They work together brilliantly. They work together and you know, they fell a shared prey and they all get to eat from the carcass. Those of us who'd like to change things, what's our incentive? Particularly if we don't think that there's much is going to come of what we do. We might feel, well, I'll feel good to do the right thing, but chances are it might not work. How many of us have asked someone to put on a mask, and how often have they said, oh yeah, you're right? Typically it's a different reaction. So I think there's a fear factor to not speaking up. And I think there's also, a cost-benefit analysis to say, what incentive do I have if this isn't going to change this individual case, let alone the wider practice in our society? And so what's starting small, we don't have 10,000 people here, but what's starting small, if everybody can bring 2 people to the next meeting and we can grow, then I think if we can change a few instances on Twitter, I believe that's going to be able to be replicated. The language, the tactics, the concept of a good gang of grace, I believe can go into all sorts of situations, both virtually and in person, once the pandemic ends, to really make a difference. Because I know that there are tens of millions of Americans who share the belief of the people on this call. Some are Republicans, some are Democrats, some voted for Trump, some voted for Biden. Some of them are interested in politics, to a great deal. Some are not interested in politics at all. But what the tens of millions share is a recognition that the status quo is horrible. It's dehumanizing, and it's keeping us from solving our problems. Race relations is a great example of an area in which the presumption of hate plays such a big role, a disproportionately large role in the public utterances, the public interactions. Whereas if there was a presumption of grace all around on all sides, things would be much smoother. Things would be able to be worked out without this freighted friction that that is so corrosive to the soul. So I'm hoping that one of the things that works well in these beta tests on Twitter is people feel confident, more confident. Because I'm eager to have a gang with me here because I know about the strength of numbers. But I'm hoping that all of us feel liberated by this, empowered by this, to recognize other situations where we can do the same thing. Because one of the hardest things, even though it's in private, is you're on the phone with a friend or an associate or a family member, and they say something, emanating from the presumption of hate, and we just laugh or we stay silent, and it just perpetuates all of this. And so I'm hoping to really change people's attitudes, to raise our own consciousnesses first, and then extend that to others who need our help to see the light. Thank you. I really appreciate you joining us tonight and you're being in touch with me. Take care. Paul.
Thank you, Mark. We've got Patrick in Georgia with a question. Patrick, go ahead.
Well, hello, Mark, from the center of the political universe in Atlanta, Georgia. How are you?
Too busy to hate.
A little different approach. Can the market correct Twitter? Now, think about Jack Dorsey, their CEO, splits his time between Twitter and Square. He lives in Africa some part of the year. The stocks only hover between 42 and 52 for the last 5 years. There's activist moves in terms of the board trying to get this thing fixed, and it's almost like there's a move. Me personally I believe that'll go to more of a subscription-based, self-identified model and kind of get rid of this dumpster fire of anonymous people that just kind of can sling any kind of nonsense out there. And then you throw into that one of their biggest draws is frankly been Trump. And, he's now doesn't have the power of the presidency, and he's going to move into some, secondary type role. So would the market fix the first head of the beast?
I mean, I get what you're saying, and I'm intrigued by it. I think that, with the exception of their desire to beat Donald Trump, their general philosophy has been the solution to bad speech is more speech, not censorship. Right. And so they'd really have to change not just their business model, but their orientation if they were going to do something that would cut this off. I don't aspire to silencing people. Mm-hmm. And again, I'll say what I said before. It's not just people who are anonymous. They're prominent people. Right. We saw some of them in the open who write just ghastly things about other people. Right. And so I think that you've seen Dorsey and other founders and leaders in the company express concern and kind of probably more than Mark Zuckerberg openly wring their hands over what have we wrought. But I don't get any indication that they've got a business model that's not based on volume. Yeah. They might have an alternative business that's a little bit more, VIP oriented, but I think they're always going to have a volume issue, and volume is always going to include people who, until we raise their consciousnesses, are going to be, interested in hatred. And that's what's rewarded. You can look at the algorithms and the statistics, and the more negative you are, the more likely you are to be retweeted. There's some exceptions to that, and I hope we start to create some of those exceptions. But for the most part, I think we're going to have to move the market a little bit for them. I don't think they'll do it on their own.
Well, though, this year, Dorsey took a severe challenge where there was serious talk about him being pushed out. Yeah. And so somewhere in that, it's not that this is some benevolence, that they're doing it because they want to show this presumption of grace. They're doing it more for that they just feel the stock is undervalued and it's not performing like a lot of the other tech stocks. Yeah, well, that's true. That's true. I just don't think they're going to get to a place where they think they'll benefit from limiting what people participate in. And again, the participation, the likes and the retweets and the comments tend to go with people who have a presumption of hatred in their content.
So
Yeah.
I think if we could figure out a way to harness the market, I think that'd be great. I think we're fighting against it, and we're going to have to be the ones to make the change and not hope that they do.
Mark, we have time for one last question. Scott from Los Angeles, please go ahead.
I think this effort is fantastic. Totally support it, want to be part of it.
Great.
In those interactions that you're proposing, it's important that our energy be, from the place that you're suggesting. Do you have a specific strategy to help people to?
Yeah, I do. I do. And you're absolutely right. It's vital. It's vital. And people will make mistakes, and we're not going to be organized. We're not going to hashtag Gang of Grace in the beginning, at least. So there'll be mistakes, and hopefully we'll learn from them, but they won't necessarily undermine the group effort or reflect on everybody. We'll send language. As I said, I don't want there to be like a cut and paste of everybody tweeting the same thing. I think it's important that it come from the heart and it be organic. But there's certain, in both in general and in specific instances, there'll be words that we'll recommend you use, or concepts, or ways to approach it. And again, we'll recommend certain people that we'll want you to reply to. Just what I do as I engage with people, for instance, on email now, and try to think about language in this exact context, is just read back what you wrote before you send it, and just ask yourself if it reflects a presumption of grace for the person whose consciousness you're trying to raise. Not call them fat, not say they wear a toupee, not say, well, you only have 12 followers, not say, I saw in another tweet, you did 3 years ago that you predicted Republicans would lose control of the Senate. Not any of that, but just the kind of language that you would use to someone if you really could speak as openly as possible, and where you have the courage of the feeling of certainty that what we're trying to do as a group is right. It's not about self-interest. It's not about trying to make money. It's not about trying to help a person win particular political office. It's about changing the culture, not our political culture or our media culture, our wider culture, from a presumption of hate to a presumption of grace. And I think the language is going to flow pretty simply. We'll send samples, but I think the language is going to flow pretty simply once we all think about it in those terms. It's not normal, and it's certainly not normal for Twitter, but that's what it's going to take. And as I said, I've been very pleasantly surprised, and I'll admit, in a couple instances, pleased with myself to respond to someone sending me very hateful emails with a presumption of grace towards them, using language carefully. I haven't been perfect, but in the cases where I think I've executed it well, it's just very hard to for someone who writes for the Daily Caller or the Daily Beast, or someone on Twitter, or all but an evildoer. It's very hard for them to look at that and say, how dare that person? How dare that person afford a presumption of grace to someone who is attacking someone else, and ask them if they would think about, the implications of their actions. So yes, language matters a lot. Yes, we'll help workshop language and suggest language, and hopefully over time, before too long, we'll learn what works and find from case to case the right language to use. But I know that when I've been called on it by someone who does it in the right way, it's very arresting. It's very disarming to be called on it in a way that's not, you have an ugly toupee, but I'd like you to slow down and think about what you're doing. It can be very effective, not with everybody, but I think with a lot of people. I think if this goes well, we'll have some early successes that will really inspire all of us to not only understand the type of language to use, but to recognize that if we use the right kind of language, it can have a real impact. I want to thank you all again for participating, for staying with us for the hour, and to hopefully agree to be part of our small initial army, a good gang of grace, to try to see if we can beta test some of this stuff and make it work. And I look forward to staying in touch with everybody on this piece of the project, this initial test, and then other ideas that people have. I think this is an exciting concept. It's an important concept. We've just got to have some real world success, so we can enlist other people, recruit other people, and prove to ourselves and to the wider world that the human heart really does want to have a presumption of grace. We just need to create the conditions to kind of break the momentum that the four-headed beast, the four-headed monster currently has. So thank you again for joining us. We appreciate it. See you soon here at another town hall.